Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome back to another episode in Chapter 28 lecture series. And our topic for this video is the female reproductive system. So let's get started with introduction to the structures of the female reproductive system and the jobs. So obviously the female reproductive system has the same functions in the female that the male reproductive system has for the male. So here we see that the female reproductive system is responsible for producing the female gamete, which is the ovum is singular, ova is plural. This is happening in the ovaries, and also the production of the female hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone, which are helping with the production of the ova, but also responsible for secondary sex characteristics, just like we talked about in males. In addition to these jobs, the female reproductive system also has the job of protecting the developing embryo and fetus, and then nourishing the infant after birth. The female gamete is produced in the ovary. That is, of course, the gonads for the female, and there are a set of follicle cells in the ovary that are going to surround that developing gamete. So that's similar to the nurse cells that we saw in the male. And then we'll see that the whole production of making that gamete is much more complicated in the female than in the male. Actually, the cell that is released by the ovary is an immature ovum, or you can call it a secondary oocyte, and it's not going to actually finish meiosis II until fertilization has occurred, and fertilization occurs in the uterine tube. From there, we would see a zygote traveling to the uterus. I've actually misspoken because a zygote is a fertilized egg, so that means one cell, and we see that that single cell divides into two cells, which divide into four cells, forming a blastocyst, which is a ball of cells before actually entering the uterus, where then you would have implantation of that embryo, development of the fetus, and then leaving the uterus through the cervix and then out the birth canal called the vagina. That is, of course, if fertilization and pregnancy occurs. The ovary is going to be attached to the uterus by an ovarian ligament, but notice that there's not a direct connection between the ovary and the uterine tube. When we talk about ovulation, we will see that that ovary will actually rupture, releasing that immature ovum or secondary oocyte into the pelvic cavity, but it's real quickly swept up into that uterine tube. You have a collection in the ovary of oocytes at different stages of development, different stages of follicles. We will see that all of those cells are formed during fetal development. And so at birth, you're born, females are born with an egg nest. And these are all of the cells that are going to be available that can possibly mature into an ovum. In an ovary that has already gone through puberty, you're going to see different stages of follicles, including mature follicles. These are the follicles that will actually rupture and release the immature ovum at ovulation and then become a structure called the corpus luteum. So we'll be talking quite a lot about each of these as we progress through. Okay, so here is the drawing that I'm going to use for female reproductive system. So you might want to pause and draw, or open up your textbook and take a look at the published artwork. We see the ovarian ligament is attaching the ovary to the uterus. And then from there, we have our uterine tube. And remember, there's not a direct connection, but there are these little finger-like projections of the uterine tube kind of over top of the ovary. So when the ovulation occurs, that immature ovum or secondary oocyte is released from the ovary, and then these fimbriae help to kind of sweep that cell up into the uterine tube. It's in the uterine tube that fertilization can occur if it's going to. So just keep in mind those sperm have had to move all the way through the uterus into the uterine tube in order to make contact with an immature ovum. And it's not until fertilization occurs that that cell will actually become the ovum. From there, we would see embryonic development happening in the uterine tube, and then that embryo can implant into the uterus. The job of the uterus is, of course, to protect and nourish a developing embryo and fetus, and then help to remove waste from the developing embryo and fetus as well. The embryo and fetus designations tell us how far along in development we are. So the embryo is the early stages, and then fetus is what we call it after really it starts to become looking like what it will look like at the end, I guess we can say, and then it's called a baby at birth. The cervix is the neck of the uterus, and it's actually surrounding an opening here called the external os, which leads into the vagina. The vagina is got really kind of wavy edges. Those are called rugae. That allows for a lot of stretch. So obviously the vagina has to be able to stretch during intercourse as well as during birth. On either side of the vagina, you have erectile tissue called the bulb of vestibule. Now, this has the same embryonic origins as the corpus spongiosum in males. What's really interesting is that we see, although male and female reproductive structures are differentiated, they have the same kind of origins and pretty much analogous structures for each male and female. The difference is really coming along in the development of the fetus with the production of different sex hormones. So if you are washing that fetus in more testosterone, then you're going to get the development of male reproductive structures. If you're washing it more in estrogen, you're going to get more female. It's a little bit more complicated than that, obviously, but that is kind of an okay way to think about it at this point. You also have that bulbospongiosus muscle on either side of the vagina, which is going to be important in constricting the vagina. Next, let's take a look at the female external genitalia. So here in this cut, we're seeing our urinary bladder and urethra, the uterus leading to the vagina, and then the rectum and anus, of course. And really, the female genitals are called the vulva or pudentum, and that includes two layers of tissue called the labium minoris and labium majoris. Now, that's the plural form because you would have these folds of tissue left and right sides when you're referring to just, or that was the singular version, and they are plural, so labia minora and labia majora would be the plural form, so you might be more familiar with that. And then, of course, you have the female erectile tissue called the clitoris, which is important in sexual arousal. Now, you're only seeing this small little portion of the clitoris extending down into the genital area. Most of it is tucked away inside the body, and it's really a bigger structure than you might think. And again, you're going to have analogous tissues here that you did with the male genitalia. So you have a glans clitoris, which is the part that's extending down in to the labia minora, and also those tissues are covering this, making the prepuce. And then on either side, embedded into the body, covered up by the vulva, you have the corpus cavernosum, which is the erectile tissue. And again, this is going to engorge with blood, just like male erectile tissue does during sexual arousal. Going back to our picture here of the genitals, you also have important glands for the female. So you have what are called greater vestibular glands that are going to secrete into the vestibule during the sexual arousal. So if you spread open the labia majoris, majora and minora, then you get into that opening, which is the vestibule. And so that's how we're getting the name here for the greater vestibular glands. This is similar or analogous to the bulbourethral gland that we saw in males. You also have some lesser vestibular glands in this area too. And then you have what are called urethral glands, which is kind of sometimes referred to as the female prostate. This is going to release a thick white secretion during sexual arousal. If you've heard of female ejaculation, then it is this secretion here which may be released. Okay, and that's it for now.